Welcome to Theology 101. Today's lecture is going to look at the topic of faith. This course is using a book called Theology, the Basics by Alister McGrath. I'll have a link to it in the description below. So, what is faith? Some people think that faith is just belief, but faith, in fact, is not belief. It's not at least a direct synonym with belief. Many beliefs are not provable or disprovable. For example, I can say that I love pizza, and you may be able to notice that I eat it a lot, but you can't actually know the strength of my affection for pizza and whether or not it rises to the term love. In the same way, I can say I'm experiencing any number of emotions, like peace, for example. And you may see me generally comfortable in life and smiling, but you don't know whether or not I'm dealing with some like anxiety inside. And so you can't actually know whether or not I'm experiencing peace. These are both sort of beliefs. You might believe that I am experiencing peace, but you can't prove it or disprove it, not totally. And certainly, belief in God's existence is one of these types of knowledge. It's something that we can argue for. We might even be able to find some things that we describe as evidence, but we can't totally prove it in a strict sense. Faith, in this sense, is not a weak form of knowledge. Okay, so it's not a synonym for like, I believe something. Instead, it's trust in one who is reliable. From the Christian perspective, to have faith in God is not so much to believe in God, but it is to trust God, right? To trust God. Now, with that being said, we do need to ask, can we prove God's existence? Can we do that? It's something that Christians, philosophers, and apologists have tried to do for centuries. And it's something that people who are opposed to Christianity try to disprove. They try to disprove God's existence. So, can we do this? Here's a quote from McGrath. He says that the existence of God is something that reason cannot prove conclusively. Yet the fact that the existence of God lies beyond reason does not for one moment mean that the existence of God is contrary to reason. Okay, so he's saying, hey, we can't totally prove God's existence. He lies beyond that, but that doesn't mean that reason is at odds with God. Okay, and I think that's a really important point. He goes on to say, certain excellent reasons may be put forward for suggesting that God exists. These do not, however, count as proofs in the sense of rigorous logical demonstrations or conclusive scientific experiments. Okay, this is not the type of knowledge that we can have about God's existence. He continues, he says that faith is about trust in God rather than just agreeing that God exists. Okay, so again, this is the idea that faith is not just belief, but it has this component of trust to it that's really critical to understand. Now, there is a famous Christian scholar named Thomas Aquinas from the Middle Ages, and he put forward these 5 arguments for the existence of God. And if you've ever looked into arguments for God's existence, you've probably come across Aquinas's work, even if the person you were reading didn't ever mention Aquinas. Okay, this is just a classic approach to the issue. Aquinas argues that we can find evidence that points towards God's existence from our general experience in the world. Okay, so we can look around the world that we live in and we can find evidence of God's existence. Here's one example that he argues. He takes this argument from movement or change. The fact that there is change in the world, the fact that things move, he would argue, provides us some evidence for God's existence. And the argument goes like this. Everything that is in motion must have a prior cause for that motion. So a ball is rolling. Something must have put the ball in motion, gravity or a person pushing it. So there must be an uncaused cause that moved the first thing. And so you would say, if you go backwards in time, if everything is caused by something else, there must, somewhere back in that line, even if you have to go way, 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 way back, there must be something that just existed so that it could cause something else and everything else that we know to exist. And so he would argue that this uncaused cause is God, right? Is evidence of God. The second is this idea of the teleological argument, or sort of the argument of purpose in design. Creation shows evidence of intentional design, Aquinas would argue, and as would many Christian scientists. So if there is this intentional design that we can observe, then there must be a designer or creator, right? And the intentional design argument would be, for human life to exist, the earth needs to sort of occupy this small space that it occupies. The planet has to be exactly the way that it is for life to exist. And if we look at that, then we must assume that there is a designer or a creator of it. The famous example of this argument was made by a guy named William Paley, who says, "Hey, if you walk, on the beach or on a planet far away, and you come across a watch, and the watch works, you'll know like this isn't just a normal rock. It seems like parts have been put together, and it does something, right? And if you recognize it as a watch, it keeps time." And so the idea is like if you find a watch, there must be a watchmaker somewhere. And this is Aquinas's argument. So those are two examples of Aquinas's five arguments, and they all work sort of similarly. Blaise Pascal argued that there were some problems with Aquinas's arguments. Okay, so he did some good work, but Blaise Pascal is going to say there are some issues. First, he would say Aquinas does not prove the existence of the God of the Bible. And this is a totally fair critique. Arguments for the existence of God are not the same things as arguments for the existence of the God of the Bible. Okay, those are two separate things. So we sort of have to take a two-step approach to this whole thing. First, can we prove the existence of God? And then can we prove that the God that we can talk about is synonymous, is the same as the God of the Bible? And Blaise Pascal will just say, Aquinas doesn't actually accomplish that. He would also say that logical proofs, like Aquinas provides, rarely provide the motivation for someone to convert to Christianity. Instead, there's something that needs to be changed in the heart, right? And so Pascal, I think, again, is right. Typically, people do not come to faith in Jesus because of logical arguments, right? There's typically something else going on. A second argument or critique of Aquinas' work comes from this guy named Ludwig Wittgenstein, which is a fun name to say. He says a proof of God's existence ought really to be something by means of which one could convince oneself that God exists. But I think that what believers who have furnished such proofs have wanted to do is to give their belief an intellectual analysis and foundation, although they themselves would never have come to believe as a result of such proofs. And so what Wittgenstein is saying is really similar to what Pascal's second objection is that these logical proofs don't necessarily persuade someone to become a Christian or even believe in God. He said instead, they're actually only persuasive to people who sort of already have a presuppositional belief in the existence of God. And I think that's a fair critique, although that doesn't mean that the arguments for existence of God put forth by Christians are somehow not worthwhile. I think having a philosophically coherent belief system is important, and it's something that should be pursued, even if it doesn't rise to the persuasive level that others might deem worthy of converting to Christianity or some other belief system. The next question we need to think about is this issue of faith and reason. How do these two topics relate to one another? How is faith related to reason? There's this quote from Pope John Paul II that McGrath pulls out that I think was really helpful. John Paul II said that faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth, in a word, to know himself, so that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves. So Pope John Paul II would argue that faith and reason are mutually beneficial. But that does not mean that reason can lead us to God. Reason alone cannot do this, right? And this is how McGrath has said that God, the existence of God lies beyond reason. It's not something that reason alone can get us to. Instead, we need God's special revelation to know him. And this has been a historic claim of Christianity, is that God had to reveal himself to us for us to know him as he is. And here's another quote from McGrath. He says, "Faith is not blind trust, opposed to the evidence of the world. Rather, it points out that the world, which Christians see as God's creation, is studded with hints of God's existence and nature." Okay, so again, reason alone can't get us to God, But special revelation, this idea that God has left hints behind in creation for us to know him, means that faith is not some blind leap into the dark. We can actually make this jump of faith in not blindly, but with some idea of what's on the other side. Martin Luther helpfully described faith in terms of trust in God, which, as I've already argued in other places of this lecture, is that faith is more than an intellectual assent to a belief system. Okay, reason alone can't get us there. Instead, faith isn't just a belief, but it is perhaps better understood in terms of trust. Faith must be personal and not purely based on belief, is what Luther would argue. We cannot simply believe that God exists. We must put our trust in him, or we will not be saved. This is how Luther would argue. McGrath quotes this: the efficacy of faith does not rest upon the intensity with which we believe, but in the reliability of the one in whom we believe. So again, McGrath is going to say this idea that faith is trust is ultimately a better path for us to be thinking about than to think of faith as belief. Another question we need to think about when we're dealing with the topic of faith is the problem of human suffering. I mean, it is one of the most difficult issues for all philosophical schools of thought. There are sort of two Christian approaches to the problem. You could add more, but there are two large ones. Alvin Plantinga is a famous Christian philosopher, and he tries to offer a solution. He says, evil is the result of humanity's free will. And free will is morally important, and a world with free will is superior to one without it. Okay, so for Plantinga, free will is critical to a good moral world. So, in keeping with his nature, being good, God must create the best world possible, which necessarily will have free will. Okay, this is how Plantinga's argument works. So, he says if the best world possible includes free will, that which means that humans can abuse free will, then God is not responsible if humans do abuse this free will and cause suffering. Right? So this is Plantinga's argument. You don't have to find it persuasive, but it is an approach trying to absolve God of any guilt of human suffering. A second approach we might think of by the famous scholar Jürgen Moltmann, who offers something more like a coping solution, a way to deal with the fact of suffering. And what Moltmann is going to argue, along with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others, is that God actually shares in human suffering. Because Jesus is God incarnate, his suffering on the cross is God's suffering. Now, some Christian traditions would say that God cannot suffer, but Moltmann and Bonhoeffer and others are going to say, no, the fact that Jesus is God and suffers means, logically, that God suffers. Here's what McGrath quotes. He says, far from being indifferent, he, that is God, shows his commitment and compassion by entering into this veil of soul making, bearing its sorrow and pain. Like God comes alongside us and experiences human suffering. So the reality is that at the end of the day, the problem of suffering is not incompatible with belief in the Christian God. There are approaches that begin to help us understand how to think about it. And ultimately, all schools of philosophy have to struggle with the fact that humans suffer, and they try to offer some answer for that. So yes, it is a challenging question that we still have to wrestle with, but it's not one that's automatically disqualifying for the Christian faith. Okay, that's it for this lecture. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe and share with a friend to help more people know about the resources at my Bible school.